The March wind rolled through Dorchester like a sigh, carrying the faint smell of salt from the harbour and the bitter tang of exhaust from early commuters. It was a quiet Boston morning until the sound of sirens fractured the calm. Blue lights flickered against the modest houses of Woodrow Avenue as neighbours gathered outside number 47, the home of Thomas Reed. Detective Sarah Donnelly stepped out of her car, the cold biting through her gloves. She was new to the department, still learning the rhythm of a city that never really slept. As she crossed the driveway, she could feel eyes on her from every direction, neighbours wrapped in coats whispering his name like it was something sacred. Thomas Reed. Inside the garage, the air was heavy. A faint smell of oil and sawdust lingered, mixed with something metallic, faint but unmistakable. Thomas Reed, a retired firefighter, lay near his workbench, his body still. The once orderly space was undisturbed except for a single overturned stool and a dark stain spreading slowly across the concrete. "Blunt force trauma," said Officer Daniels, his voice low. No signs of forced entry. Sarah's eyes moved across the room. The tool rack was full, the workbench neat. The only thing that stood out was a burnt match lying near his boot. Odd, she thought. A man who'd spent his life running from flames. Why a match? Outside, the chatter grew louder. People spoke of Reed with reverence. The man who had saved lives, who taught neighborhood kids to stay out of trouble, who shoveled sidewalks for elderly neighbors. There was disbelief, then fear. If someone could kill Thomas Reed, no one in Dorchester felt safe. Back in the kitchen, Sarah spoke with a woman wrapped in a shawl. "He was out here last night," the woman said. "I saw his light on around 9. He waved at me. He was smiling." "Did he have visitors?" Sarah asked. The woman hesitated. "Maybe. I heard a truck, late. Could have been Frank from next door, but it didn't sound like Frank's truck." Sarah jotted it down. The small details mattered, the kind that didn't make sense until they suddenly did. She turned once more to look through the open garage door. The morning sun was breaking through the clouds, but it did nothing to warm the air. Something about the stillness of the place unsettled her. A man who faced fire his whole life shouldn't end up like this, cold, alone, in the dark. As the coroner's van pulled away, Sarah lingered by the curb, glancing at the rows of small brick homes. Someone in that crowd knew something. Someone had walked into that garage last night and left without a trace. She didn't know it yet, but this case would follow her for years. And for those who follow stories that seek the truth, this one will burn brighter than you think. Subscribe now and stay with me. This is just the beginning. Thomas Reed had once been the kind of man every kid in Dorchester looked up to. Long before his name was whispered through police radios, he was known as Chief, even though he'd retired years earlier. He carried the quiet pride of a man who'd faced the worst and come back with his soul still intact, or so people believed. Born and raised in South Boston, Thomas had joined the fire department at 21, following in his father's footsteps. He wasn't loud or boastful, but his courage had a way of speaking for him. The story everyone remembered best was the Trinity Church fire of 1990, when the building collapsed around his team. Thomas carried 3 children out of the inferno that night, his turnout coat still smoldering as he refused medical attention. But he never forgave himself for what came next, the death of his partner, Roy Beckett. After that, something in him changed. He kept showing up for work, always dependable, always first into danger. But there was a shadow that followed him. He stopped going out with the crew after shifts, stopped celebrating victories. The guys said he was haunted by smoke. When he finally retired in 2001, most thought he'd fade quietly into the background. Instead, Thomas poured his energy into the neighborhood. He volunteered at the local youth center on Columbia Road, teaching woodworking and mentoring kids who'd lost their way. He fixed broken fences, helped rebuild porches after storms, and ran a small carpentry business out of his garage. That was his sanctuary, where he worked late into the night, shaping raw wood into something new, something better. Neighbors recalled seeing him in that garage almost every evening. He'd keep the radio tuned to old rock stations, humming to Springsteen or Tom Petty while sanding a piece of oak. His hands were rough, but his touch was careful, the kind of precision that came from decades of holding tools meant to save lives. His wife, Ellen, had passed away 2 years earlier after a long battle with cancer. Her death hit him hard. Yet instead of retreating from life, Thomas began reaching out more. He said helping others helped him forget the fire, one of the kids he mentored told Detective Sarah Donnelly. He said, "We all carry something heavy. You just got to make it mean something." Sarah listened quietly, taking notes in her worn leather pad. Every story painted Thomas as the same man, selfless, kind, stubbornly hopeful. The idea that someone would want to harm him didn't fit. But as she flipped through his personnel file later that night, one detail caught her attention. Thomas had made several requests for access to old incident reports in his final months as a firefighter. Fires tied to construction sites, suspicious origins. She circled the names, each one connected to a company she didn't yet recognize. There was a pattern forming beneath the surface. Something told her Thomas Reed hadn't left the firehouse behind completely. Detective Sarah Donnelly stood once more in Thomas Reed's garage, the scent of motor oil still clinging to the air. The place had been sealed since the discovery, yellow tape cutting through the stillness like a scar. She ran her hand along the edge of the workbench, smooth, polished, recently cleaned. Every tool hung in perfect alignment, every nail labeled in small jars. Whoever had been here knew exactly where to strike without leaving chaos behind. The forensics team had combed through every inch. No fingerprints, no signs of forced entry, no broken locks. Just that one burnt match near the boot of the victim. Sarah couldn't stop thinking about it. Reed had been terrified of open flames ever since the Trinity Church fire. He'd even replaced his gas stove with an electric one. So why was there a burnt match on the floor of his garage? Officer Daniels entered, holding a clipboard. "Autopsy came back," he said. "Single blow to the head. Heavy object, maybe a wrench or crowbar. No defensive wounds." "So he didn't fight back," Sarah murmured. "Or he trusted whoever was here." Daniels nodded. "No prints on the weapon either. We found a few faint footprints, but they're smudged. Could be anyone's." Sarah crouched, studying the concrete. Something caught her eye, a faint grey smear near the workbench. She touched it with a gloved finger. "Ash?" she asked. Daniels frowned. "We thought it might be dust, but the lab says it's residue. Burned wood, maybe paper." Her stomach tightened. "In a man's garage who hated fire." She stared at the stain, the thought flickering in her mind like a spark. "What was burned here?" Outside, a few neighbors lingered behind the tape. Sarah stepped out to question them again. The first was Frank Lattimore, Reed's next-door neighbor, a heavy-set man in a Patriot's cap. He kept his hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets, avoiding her eyes. "Mr. Lattimore, you said you heard something that night," she prompted. He shifted uncomfortably. "Just an engine. Late, maybe midnight. Thought it was one of those delivery trucks, didn't think much of it." "Could you see it?" "No, just heard it. Sounded like a pickup, though. Older model. Low rumble, you know? Not the kind that sneaks around easy." Sarah made a note. "Anyone else come by the house lately?" He shook his head. Thomas kept to himself mostly. After Ellen passed, he was different. Still nice, but quieter. Said he was working on something important. I figured it was just another one of his wood projects. Sarah looked back at the garage, the dark windows staring back like hollow eyes. Whatever Thomas had been working on, it wasn't just carpentry. Later that afternoon, she stood alone near the curb, the wind cutting through her coat. Something about the orderliness of that garage bothered her deeply. No struggle, no panic, just a single act of violence in a place built on discipline. She didn't know yet what the ash meant, or the match, or the missing piece in that spotless room. But she knew one thing for certain: this wasn't random. Someone had come to Thomas Reed's garage with purpose. And whatever he'd uncovered before his death, it had been worth killing for. Boston Fire Station 23 sat at the corner of Dorchester Avenue and Adams Street, its red brick facade weathered by decades of smoke and salt air. Inside, the walls were lined with old photographs, men in soot-streaked uniforms, proud and smiling. Thomas Reed's face appeared in several of them, standing shoulder to shoulder with the same crew who once ran into burning buildings without hesitation. Detective Sarah Donnelly signed in at the front desk and waited as the receptionist disappeared down the hall. The smell of coffee and diesel mixed in the air, a scent that never left a firehouse. Moments later, Captain Mark Jensen appeared. He was tall, grey-haired and broad-shouldered, though his eyes carried a weight that went deeper than years. "Detective Donnelly," he said, shaking her hand with a firm grip. "Thomas Reed. Hell of a loss. Haven't stopped thinking about it." "I appreciate your time, Captain," Sarah replied. "I know this isn't easy." He motioned toward the common room, where the low hum of conversation faded as they entered. She could feel the tension. The men around the table avoided eye contact, their voices dying into silence. "Tom was one of the best," Jensen said finally, sitting across from her. "Could read a fire like no one else." "We used to joke that he could smell smoke before the alarms went off," Sarah nodded. "Did you stay in touch after he retired?" "A bit," Jensen answered carefully. "He came by now and then. Talked to the younger guys, shared stories, that kind of thing. He missed the job, but he said retirement gave him peace." He paused, looking down at his hands. "Guess that didn't last." She studied him for a moment. His tone was respectful, but there was something rehearsed in the way he spoke, like a man choosing every word. "Did he ever mention feeling threatened? Anyone holding a grudge?" Jensen's gaze flickered. "You spend 30 years running into fires. You make enemies with bad luck, not people." Sarah leaned back slightly. "I found notes in his personnel file, requests for access to old reports, fires tied to construction sites. You were his commanding officer at the time. Do you know why he was looking into those?" He hesitated, his jaw tightening. Tom never could let go of unfinished business. Some of those fires didn't sit right with him, that's true, but the department looked into it. Nothing came of it. "Still," Sarah said, "he must have believed there was more to it." Jensen stood, pacing near the wall of photos. "Detective, when you've seen as much as we have, you start seeing ghosts where there aren't any. Tom carried a lot of guilt. That church fire. It changed him." The conversation ended soon after. As Sarah stepped outside, the sky had turned a heavy grey, the wind sharp off the harbour. She paused on the sidewalk, glancing back at the station. Behind those brick walls, loyalty ran deep, sometimes deeper than truth. And she couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere in there, someone knew more than they were willing to admit. Rain swept across Boston the next morning, drumming softly on the roof of Detective Sarah Donnelly's car as she parked outside a modest house in Quincy. Ellen Reed's sister, Margaret Hale, had agreed to meet her. The house smelled faintly of cinnamon and old books, a comforting contrast to the grey world outside. Margaret led her to the dining table, where a small cardboard box sat, worn and taped along the edges. "These were Thomas's things," she said quietly. "After Ellen passed, he gave them to me for safekeeping. Said if anything ever happened to him, someone should look inside." Sarah carefully opened the box. Inside were photographs, commendation letters from the fire department, and a faded Red Sox cap. Beneath them, wrapped in an old handkerchief, was a small, leather-bound journal. The pages were filled with neat handwriting, concise, deliberate. At first, it seemed like notes from his volunteer work, project plans and schedules, but as Sarah read deeper, the tone changed. April 12, 2002. Something's off about the Grant Street fire. Reports don't match the damage I saw. Engine 23 was first on scene, but Jensen's name is missing from the official log. Sarah frowned, flipping through the pages. Thomas had listed several similar fires. Small construction sites, warehouses, buildings slated for renovation. Each one was marked with initials and coded references. Margaret sat across from her, hands folded tightly. "He never talked about this, but I could tell something was eating at him," she said. "He'd been meeting people, making calls. I asked once what it was about, and he just said, 'It's time I finish what I started.'" "Finish what?" Sarah asked. Margaret shook her head. "He didn't say, but he started locking the garage. That was new." "Thomas never locked anything." Sarah looked up from the journal. "Did he mention anyone by name?" Margaret thought for a moment. Only one name stuck with me. A man called Jensen. He said Jensen was too deep in it to turn back. I assumed it was something from their firefighting days. Sarah closed the journal, her mind racing. Jensen, the same man who'd looked her in the eye and said Thomas was chasing ghosts. Before leaving, Margaret handed her a small brass key. "Thomas wanted you to have this if it ever came to it," she said. "It opens the bottom drawer of his workbench." Back in her car, Sarah turned the journal over in her hands. The rain had stopped, but the clouds hung low, heavy with the promise of more. She flipped to the last written page. "If they find this, it means I was right. The fire was never just a fire." The words sent a chill through her. She didn't know yet what Thomas had uncovered, but she knew one thing for certain. He'd been getting close to something dangerous, and someone had made sure he'd never finish what he started. Detective Sarah Donnelly felt the weight of Thomas Reed's journal pressing against her inside coat pocket as she climbed the steps of the precinct the next morning. The corridors buzzed with phones and the echo of hurried footsteps. Yet when she entered the homicide division, the air grew colder. Conversations stopped, eyes followed her, then turned away. She'd felt resistance before, but this was different, heavier, deliberate. Lieutenant Kevin Malone called her into his office. His voice carried that calm authority she'd come to recognize as dangerous. "Sarah, I read your report on Reed," he began, flipping through her notes. "You've got some interesting theories here. Fires, construction companies, missing records. But we're investigating a homicide, not a city scandal." "With respect, sir," she said evenly, "those fires are connected. Reed found something worth killing for." Malone closed the file slowly. "Or maybe he was an old man chasing ghosts. You've been in this job long enough to know that not every mystery is a conspiracy. I'm reassigning you to assist major crimes." "This Reed case is going cold." Her chest tightened. "You're shutting it down?" He looked her dead in the eye. "You're done with it, detective. That's an order." Sarah left without another word. Her hands shook, anger building beneath her calm exterior. It wasn't the first time a promising lead had been buried in paperwork, but this one felt personal. She couldn't ignore it. That evening she returned to Dorchester. The street was quiet, washed in the amber glow of streetlights. Near the curb, a young man leaned against a rusted bike, watching her approach. "You're Detective Donnelly?" he asked. "Name's Kyle Turner. I used to hang around with Mr. Reed. He helped me get off probation." Sarah nodded. "What can you tell me about him, Kyle?" Kyle hesitated. "I was out late that night near the corner store. I saw a truck parked by his house, grey pickup, older model, engine running. I thought it was his friend Frank, but it wasn't. Different sound. Rougher, louder." "Did you see who was inside?" He shook his head. "No, but whoever it was, they didn't stay long. Maybe 15 minutes. Then the lights in the garage went out." Sarah thanked him and handed him her card. As she turned to leave, Kyle called after her. "He said something weird a few days before he died. Said he was going to clear some names before it was too late." I thought he meant old fire records or something. Back in her car, she sat in silence, her mind racing. Jensen. Malone. The same names echoing through Reed's journal. Her phone buzzed suddenly. "Unknown number," she answered. A distorted voice whispered through the static, "You need to stop digging, detective. Some fires were meant to stay out." The line went dead. Sarah stared through the windshield into the darkness. For the first time she felt it, that thin electric line between duty and danger. And she knew crossing it would change everything. The night weighed heavy over Boston, clouds pressing low against the skyline as Detective Sarah Donnelly replayed the phone call in her mind. The voice, calm, deliberate, almost intimate, had carved itself into her thoughts. Some fires were meant to stay out. It wasn't a threat. It was a warning. She spent the following morning buried in Thomas Reed's journal again, tracing his handwriting, like she could feel the pulse of the man behind the words. One page stood out. "If I don't stop them, someone will get hurt. Maybe me." The line looked rushed, as if he'd written it moments before something interrupted him. Sarah's instincts screamed that his final hours held the key. She reviewed the case files again, Time of death, 10:47 p.m. The neighbor heard a truck around midnight. Whoever killed him had taken time to make it look clean. Too clean. By afternoon, Sarah drove back to Dorchester. The house looked smaller now, lifeless. She stood by the garage door, listening to the wind slip through the narrow cracks. Every sound felt amplified. A loose gutter, a creaking board, her own breath. Inside, she opened the bottom drawer of the workbench, using the brass key Margaret had given her. Dust scattered as the drawer slid open, revealing a few broken pencils, an old lighter and a small metal tin. Inside the tin were burned scraps of paper, edges curled black. She could make out faint words: report, Jensen, and fire logs. Someone had tried to destroy evidence. Sarah's pulse quickened. She looked around the room, searching for something, anything, that might have survived the burning. Then, near the baseboard, she noticed a small plank slightly raised. She pried it loose. Beneath it lay a folded photograph, half charred, the edges brittle. The image was of 4 men in turnout gear, arms slung over each other's shoulders. Thomas Reed stood on the left. Next to him, unmistakably, was Mark Jensen. The other 2 she didn't recognize. One face, however, had been deliberately torn out. She turned the photo over. Faded handwriting read, "Trinity is the night everything changed." The sound of rain began tapping against the roof again, and for a moment Sarah imagined Thomas standing here on a night just like this, staring at that same picture, wondering who he could trust. Her phone buzzed and a text from an unknown number. "You're in over your head." No name, no punctuation. Sarah exhaled slowly. "Maybe," she whispered to herself, "but I'm still breathing." As she left the garage, she looked back one last time. The burnt scraps, the hidden photograph, the unfinished journal, they all told fragments of the same story. Thomas Reed hadn't stumbled into trouble by accident. He'd been chasing the truth about something buried deep within the department, something tied to fire, betrayal, and guilt. And now, 20 years later, that same fire was beginning to burn again. The following week, Detective Sarah Donnelly sat alone in her apartment, the photo from Reed's garage spread out on the table, beside a half-empty mug of coffee. The faces stared back at her: Reed, Jensen, 2 others, and that torn corner where a 4th face once was. The caption still echoed in her mind. Trinity, the night everything changed. Sarah began cross-referencing old department records, searching through every report from the Trinity Church fire of 1990. The digital archives were incomplete, many of the older files scanned from faded paper. Hours passed before she found it. A list of responders that night: Thomas Reed, Mark Jensen, a few others, and one name that no longer appeared in active duty rosters: Roy Beckett. Beckett's file was thin: commendations, service records, and a final note dated 6 months after the Trinity fire. Presumed deceased, no remains recovered. But there was no report of a body, no funeral, no closure. Just silence. Sarah frowned. She typed the name into public databases, obituaries, even social security records. Nothing. Roy Beckett had vanished. The next morning, she visited Chief Randall Pierce, now retired, living north of the city. His small home overlooked the Merrimack River, the yard cluttered with rusted fire helmets and old photographs. "Roy Beckett," she said after introducing herself, "what can you tell me about him?" The old man's eyes flickered with something between surprise and regret. "That's a name I haven't heard in a long time," he said. "Roy was a good kid, bit reckless, but heart in the right place. The night of Trinity changed him, changed all of them." "You mean Reed and Jensen?" Sarah asked. Pierce nodded. "Roy froze in the fire. He made a bad call, one that nearly cost lives. Reed covered for him, said the collapse was an accident. That's what the report says, but we all knew better." He leaned back, sighing. "After that, Roy couldn't live with himself. He quit, disappeared. Tom tried to help him, but he wouldn't answer his calls." "Do you think he's alive?" Pierce hesitated. If anyone could disappear, it'd be Roy. He knew how to make fire erase everything. Driving back to Boston, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that Roy was the missing link. Reed had written about a man he'd once protected from the flames. That had to be Beckett, and if Beckett was alive, he might hold the truth about what happened both in 1990 and in Reed's garage 13 years later. She pulled over at a rest stop, opened her laptop and began tracing property records. One address appeared repeatedly under variations of Beckett's initials, a small town in New Hampshire. Sarah leaned back in her seat, the hum of passing trucks filling the silence. If Roy Beckett had been hiding all these years, she was about to find him. But as she closed the laptop, a thought crept in. If Reed had found Beckett before his death, maybe that meeting hadn't ended the way anyone expected. The drive to New Hampshire took Sarah through narrow, winding roads blanketed in snow. The storm had passed hours earlier, leaving the world quiet, almost too still. According to the records she'd found, the property belonged to a Robert Beck, a name that felt too convenient, too close to the one she was chasing. The mailbox leaned sideways, the paint faded, the letters almost erased by time. She parked at the edge of the long driveway. The cabin sat deep in the woods, surrounded by tall pines and silence. Smoke drifted from the chimney, faint but real. Someone was here. When the door finally opened, the man standing there looked older than his years. His beard was grey, his face weathered, eyes sharp yet wary. "You're lost?" he said flatly. "Roy Beckett?" Sarah asked, her voice steady. His eyes flickered, just for a second. "Never heard of him." She took a slow breath. "Thomas Reed, Boston Fire Department." "You served together." The color drained from his face. He stepped back, muttering, "You shouldn't have come." Inside, the cabin was sparse but lived in. Wood stove, scattered papers, an old firefighter's helmet on the shelf. She noticed a framed photograph on the mantel, the same 4 men from the photo she'd found, this time with all their faces intact. "You lied about being dead," Sarah said quietly. "Why?" Roy sat down heavily, rubbing his hands together. "Because it was easier than living with what I did." His voice cracked slightly. "That night at Trinity, the fire wasn't an accident. We were ordered to let it burn. Insurance job, backroom deals. I froze when the roof came down. Thomas pulled those kids out while I stood there, useless." Sarah listened, the sound of the crackling fire filling the silence between his words. "Afterward, they blamed a wiring fault. Jensen signed off on it. Reed didn't buy it. He started digging. When he found proof, they told him to back off." Roy looked up, meeting her eyes. "You think he stopped?" "No," Sarah said. "He kept going until someone stopped him for good." Roy nodded slowly. "He came here, said he wanted to clear my name, said he finally had the evidence. I told him to leave it alone. I couldn't handle that world again." "What happened that night?" she asked. "I told him to go home," Roy whispered. "He did. I never saw him again." Sarah reached into her coat and pressed the recorder's button. The soft click broke the rhythm of the fire. "Roy, who ordered those fires?" He stared into the flames, his reflection shimmering in the glass. "You already know the answer," he said. "It was never about the buildings. It was about the people who owned them." Before she could ask more, a loud crack echoed from outside, wood splintering under weight. Roy froze. "They found me," he said. Sarah turned off the recorder, but when she checked it hours later in her car, the file was gone, erased as if it never existed. Someone had been listening. The city looked different after Sarah's trip to New Hampshire, colder, smaller, as if every brick and streetlight carried a secret. She parked outside Boston PD headquarters, her mind still circling Roy Beckett's words. "You already know the answer." The problem was she did. She just didn't want to admit it. Inside, the halls were quieter than usual. Conversations hushed when she passed. A few detectives she'd worked with for years avoided her eyes. Someone had leaked word that she'd gone off-book. It didn't take long before Lieutenant Kevin Malone called her in. He sat behind his desk, tie loosened, a file open in front of him. "You took a department vehicle across state lines without clearance," he said, voice low but sharp. "You're lucky I don't write you up for insubordination." Sarah stood firm. "Roy Beckett's alive, and he told me Reed was investigating fires connected to city contracts. Construction companies getting paid twice for the same projects. First through insurance, then redevelopment funds. Jensen's name is in Reed's notes, and yours. Malone's hand slammed the desk. Watch yourself, detective. You think I don't see it? She pressed. Thomas Reed was killed because he was getting close. You're trying to bury it again. Malone leaned back, his expression unreadable. You don't know what you're talking about. Those fires were investigated years ago, case closed. Then why erase my recording from Beckett's cabin? She asked. You think I wouldn't notice? He smiled faintly. You should be careful where you point that kind of accusation. For a moment the office was silent, except for the hum of the old fluorescent light above them. Sarah stared at him, the calm, steady man who'd mentored her when she first joined the department. The realization felt like a gut punch. You were there, she said quietly. Malone didn't answer. Instead, he closed the file, stood up, and walked to the window. Do yourself a favor, he said. Go home, forget Thomas Reed, forget Beckett. You don't want to end up like them. He left her standing there, alone with the sound of her own heartbeat. That night, Sarah sat in her apartment surrounded by Reed's journal, Beckett's partial confession, and crime scene photos spread across her table. Every piece pointed back to the same circle: the fire department, the police, and a web of construction companies tied to both. She logged into the department database again, this time searching pension records. The results made her blood run cold. Captain Mark Jensen had received a sudden payout in 2001, the same year several of those suspicious fires occurred, and Malone's signature was on the approval form. It wasn't just corruption, it was collusion. Sarah leaned back, exhaustion washing over her. The boundaries between law and betrayal blurred like smoke in her mind. Whatever had started with Thomas Reed hadn't ended in that garage. It was still burning, and she was standing right in the middle of it. Snow fell over Boston like quiet ash as Detective Sarah Donnelly parked near City Hall just after midnight. The streets were slick, the air sharp, the kind of cold that burned the lungs. She'd waited until the building was nearly empty, knowing what she was about to do could cost her career. But after what she'd uncovered, she couldn't stop now. Inside, the hum of fluorescent lights echoed through the long marble corridors. Her breath formed small clouds as she moved toward the records archive, the department's forgotten floor. The door creaked open to rows of metal cabinets stacked with dusty boxes. She scanned the labels until one caught her eye: City Redevelopment, 1998-2003. Her flashlight beam trembled slightly as she flipped through the files. Dozens of arson reports matched the same pattern Thomas Reed had outlined in his journal. Every one of those burned buildings had later been rebuilt under a company called Harbor Front Construction, a name that appeared again and again. And then she saw it, a purchase order signed by Lieutenant Kevin Malone, authorizing emergency demolition funds after the fires. Next to it, a contract renewal listing Mark Jensen as site safety consultant, the names linked like a chain pulled too tight. Sarah's stomach twisted. This was it, the proof Reed had died trying to find. She gathered the files and stuffed them into her bag, but as she turned, something metal clattered behind her. She froze. A voice echoed softly down the hallway. Detective Donnelly. She spun around. A janitor stepped into the light, startled by her presence. Late night, huh? He asked. Just following up on a request, she said calmly, forcing a smile. He nodded and left. The tension in her chest eased, but the moment reminded her that every second mattered. She needed more, something irrefutable. Back at her apartment, she opened the sealed evidence box from Reed's case. Inside, beneath the standard inventory, was the floppy disk she'd retrieved earlier from the garage. Her old laptop whirred to life as she inserted it, the screen flickering before revealing a series of labeled image files. Each photo showed charred ruins of buildings, warehouses, offices, housing complexes. But what chilled her were the timestamps. The pictures had been taken days before the fires officially occurred, the same sites later listed in city insurance claims. She clicked through, her pulse quickening. One folder was marked simply Truth. Inside was a scanned page from a handwritten note, Reed's handwriting. They think they can burn their sins away, but fire doesn't erase truth. It only leaves ashes. Sarah leaned back, the words sinking deep. Reed hadn't just been investigating corruption. He'd been documenting it piece by piece, until someone realized how close he was. Outside, a siren wailed in the distance, sharp, rising, and then fading into silence. Sarah saved everything to a backup drive, locked the files in a separate envelope, and stared out at the dark city below. For the first time, she saw Boston for what it truly was, a city built not just on stone and steel, but on the ashes of those who dared to speak the truth. Detective Sarah Donnelly parked 2 blocks away from Mark Jensen's suburban home, the file of evidence resting on the passenger seat beside her. The air outside was crisp, the sun just beginning to set, casting long amber shadows across the snow. She'd spent the last 48 hours confirming everything Thomas Reed had written, the fake reports, the bribes, the deliberate arsons disguised as accidents. Every path led back to Jensen and Malone. And tonight one of them was going to talk. When Jensen opened the door, his face paled. "Sarah," he said softly, glancing past her as if expecting someone else. "You shouldn't be here." "Neither should you," she replied, stepping inside. "You've been cashing payments through Harborfront Construction for years. Thomas found out. That's why he's dead." Jensen shut the door slowly, his hands trembling. "You don't understand. It wasn't supposed to go that far." "Then explain it," she said. "Tell me how a man who spent his life saving others ends up beaten to death in his own garage." He sank into a chair, his voice low. "Thomas was a good man. Too good. He couldn't let things lie. When the first fire happened, it was meant to be controlled, an empty building for insurance. Nobody was supposed to get hurt. But then one burned after another, and Malone kept finding ways to make more money. I tried to pull out, but once you're in, you can't walk away." Sarah set a photo on the table, the same one from Reed's garage. "Who's missing from this picture?" Jensen stared at it for a long moment before answering. "Roy Beckett. He wasn't supposed to die in that church fire." He froze and Tom covered for him. That secret tied them together. When Tom started digging years later, he said he wanted to clear Roy's name. But what he really found was us. "You killed him," Sarah said quietly. He shook his head violently. "No. I went to talk to him that night, yes, to warn him. I told him to stop, to let it go, but when I left, he was alive." "I swear." "Then who did it?" she asked. Jensen hesitated, eyes darting toward the window. "He came after me too, you know. Said I'd talk eventually. Said he'd make sure I never could." "Who, Mark?" Before he could answer, the sound of a car door slammed outside. Jensen's eyes widened. "You have to go," he whispered. But it was too late. The front door opened without knocking. Lieutenant Kevin Malone stepped inside, his expression cold, gun raised. "Detective Donnelly," he said calmly, "I told you to let this go." Sarah drew her weapon, her voice steady despite the pounding in her chest. "You murdered Thomas Reed." Malone's eyes flickered toward Jensen. "You talk, you die," he said. Jensen's hand shook as he looked between them. "Kevin, please." The moment stretched, thick with tension, every breath sharp as glass. For years Sarah had wondered what betrayal looked like. Now, standing there between 2 men bound by corruption and guilt, she finally knew. The silence inside Mark Jensen's living room was suffocating, broken only by the faint creak of Malone's shoes on the hardwood floor. His gun stayed steady, trained first on Jensen, then on Sarah. "You just couldn't leave it alone," he said, his voice controlled, almost calm. "You had to dig into things that didn't concern you." Sarah's finger tightened on the trigger, though she kept her aim low. "Thomas Reed's murder concerns me," she said, "and so does the corruption you buried under his ashes." Malone smirked. "Reed was a fool. He thought he could expose people who built this city, people who make sure it runs. You think anyone will believe a detective who broke into city archives and stole evidence? You've already destroyed your own case." Jensen's voice cracked from across the room. "Kevin, stop. She knows everything now. It's over." Malone turned to him, his tone darkening. "You think you're walking away from this, Mark? You were part of it too. You took their money. You kept your mouth shut." "I didn't kill him," Jensen said, shaking his head. "You did." Malone's jaw flexed. "He left me no choice. He had the files, the pictures, the names. He was going to the press. Sarah steadied her breathing. "And now you'll kill another man to keep it quiet?" Malone's eyes met hers, cold and empty. "If that's what it takes." For a heartbeat, the world stopped. Jensen's voice broke through the stillness, trembling but defiant. "You always said we were saving the department, that we were cleaning up the city, but all we did was burn it down." Malone raised the gun toward him. "You were never supposed to feel guilty." The shot rang out like thunder, echoing through the house. Sarah dove behind the couch, glass shattering as another bullet struck the window. Her ears rang, her pulse roaring in her chest. Jensen collapsed against the wall, blood darkening his sleeve. He was still alive, barely. "Finish it," he gasped, tossing something across the floor, a small flash drive sliding to Sarah's feet. "Proof. Everything you need." Malone advanced, but Sarah fired once, the bullet grazing his shoulder. He stumbled, growling through gritted teeth. "You're making a mistake, Donnelly. You think this ends with me?" "Maybe not," she said, standing tall, gun steady. "But it ends tonight." He hesitated, blood dripping down his arm, eyes flickering between the door and her weapon. Then, in a moment of rage and fear, he bolted for the back exit. By the time Sarah reached the porch, he was gone, his taillights fading into the blackness. Back inside, Jensen was fading fast. "Tell them, I'm sorry," he whispered. His eyes met hers, glassy and distant. "Thomas didn't deserve it." Sarah knelt beside him, her voice soft. "Neither did you." When the sirens finally wailed in the distance, she sat in the wreckage of that quiet suburban home, the flash drive clenched tightly in her hand. The long night was over, but the fire Thomas Reed started had only just begun. 2 decades passed before the truth finally surfaced. The city of Boston had changed. New glass towers piercing the skyline, old neighborhoods rebuilt, memories paved over. But for Detective Sarah Donnelly, the fire never truly went out. She'd left the department 5 years after that night, unable to work under the same badge that had shielded corruption. Still, she never stopped chasing justice for Thomas Reed. It was late autumn when the call came. She was sitting in her small apartment in Cambridge, sipping coffee and reading the morning news when her phone buzzed. The number was unfamiliar. "Detective Donnelly?" the voice asked. "This is Special Agent Moore with the FBI's Cold Case Division. We thought you'd want to hear this personally. We've reopened the Reed investigation, and there's been a development." Her heart stilled. "What kind of development?" "We ran new DNA analysis on preserved evidence from the garage. That burnt match you noted in your original report. The partial print on it came back with a confirmed match. Kevin Malone." Sarah's grip tightened around the phone. For years, Malone had vanished, leaving behind no trace. "Where is he?" she asked. "Florida, living under the name Richard Keenan. We're coordinating with local authorities for the arrest. He's in custody as of this morning." She leaned back in her chair, the weight of 20 years pressing down all at once. "You got him," she whispered. Later that week, she flew to Miami to watch the extradition hearing. Malone looked older, thinner, his once commanding presence eroded by time and guilt. When he saw her across the courtroom, his eyes flickered, not with remorse, but recognition. The last tether between hunter and hunted had finally snapped. Outside the courthouse, reporters crowded the steps, shouting questions. Is it true a former Boston lieutenant killed a firefighter to cover up city corruption? Will there be charges against others involved? Sarah didn't answer. She simply walked past, the humid air clinging to her like smoke. Back in Boston, news of Malone's arrest spread fast. The city was stunned. The man once celebrated for his leadership was now exposed as the architect of a decades-long cover-up. Investigations reopened, files resurfaced, and the names Thomas Reed had written in his journal were finally spoken aloud in court. One winter morning, Sarah stood outside Fire Station 23. A plaque had been placed near the entrance, in honor of Thomas Reed, 1949-2003. A firefighter who never stopped fighting. She traced the letters with her gloved hand, her breath clouding in the cold. A younger firefighter approached her quietly. "You knew him, didn't you?" She nodded. "He taught me what it means to stand for something." Even when it burns. The man smiled faintly. My dad used to talk about him. Said he was the kind of firefighter who made you believe the job meant something. Sarah looked out across Dorchester Avenue, the city humming with life again. It still does, she said softly, because of people like him. And for the first time in 20 years, the fire inside her finally began to cool. The wind swept through Mount Hope Cemetery, carrying with it the faint scent of salt from the harbour and the whisper of distant sirens. Detective Sarah Donnelly stood beside the weathered headstone of Thomas Reed, a simple marker etched with his name, his years of service, and the emblem of the Boston Fire Department. The ground beneath her boots was firm, frozen by the late winter chill. She placed a folded copy of his journal at the base of the stone. You were right, Thomas, she murmured. The truth always burns its way out. It had been 3 months since Kevin Malone's conviction, second-degree murder, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. The trial had pulled the city through waves of disbelief and anger. When the verdict was read, Sarah hadn't felt triumph, only relief. The kind that comes when a long fight finally ends, even if victory feels like loss. The department had changed in those months. Fire Station 23 now stood under new leadership, its walls lined with restored photographs of those who'd served honorably. Jensen's name had been quietly added to a memorial plaque, his family given the truth they'd been denied. And every rookie firefighter who joined the Boston Fire Department now learned about Thomas Reed, the man who refused to look away when others did. As Sarah stood in the cold, the sky began to open, sunlight breaking through the clouds in muted gold. It caught the edge of Reed's headstone, and for a fleeting moment it seemed to glow. Footsteps crunched behind her. A familiar voice called out, "You never did like goodbyes." She turned to see Agent Moore, hands tucked into his coat pockets, eyes kind but tired. "Just making sure he knows it's finally over," Sarah replied. Moore nodded. "Boston owes you for this. Not just the case, the cleanup that came after. You exposed something that would have stayed buried forever." She smiled faintly. "Reed exposed it. I just followed his trail." He handed her an envelope. "The department wanted you to have this." Inside was a photograph, the old one from the garage now restored. Reed, Jensen, Beckett, and the rest of their crew, arms slung around each other, smiling in front of Station 23. At the bottom someone had written in pen, "The fire never dies, it just changes hands." Sarah traced the words, a quiet warmth rising in her chest. "He'd like that," she said softly. They walked back toward the gate, the sound of wind carrying through the rows of graves. As they reached her car, Moore stopped. "What will you do now?" "Keep working," she said. "There are always fires that need putting out, not the kind with flames." He gave a small nod before walking away, his figure fading into the sunlight. Sarah looked back one last time at Reed's grave. "Rest easy, Chief," she whispered. "You saved more lives than you ever knew." Then she turned toward the city, her city, and walked forward, the faint warmth of justice flickering quietly within her. And for those who believe in stories that uncover the truth, stay with us. There's always another fire waiting to be told.